From being the 16th seed and a surprising debut to a roller coaster of wins and losses. Here's why Brandon Moreno is a one-hit wonder. Humble beginnings or lack of experience? Picture this. Moreno, just a fresh-faced 22-year-old with an 11-3 record, gets chosen as one of the fighters on season 24 of The Ultimate Fighter. Now, I'll be honest, he wasn't exactly the most experienced guy in the bunch when compared to the other cast members. But hey, he was up for the challenge. Out of the 16 members, he went head-to-head with the top-seeded Brazilian, Alexandre Pantoja. Sadly, things didn't go quite as planned for the young fighter, and he ended up submitting in the second round. Ouch. The competition was over before it had even begun. And for a while, it seemed like that was it for him. But fate had other plans. Just over a week before a fight between Luis Smolka and Sergio Pettis, the Phenom was forced to pull out. And guess who the UFC called to step in and make his promotional debut? Yep, that's right, Brandon Moreno. He realized what opportunity had fallen onto his lap, and he wasn't about to let it slip. In his first ever UFC fight, he landed a guillotine choke on Smolka and got the win before the halfway mark of the opening round. After this, the victories kept coming for Assassin Baby. He came back to the octagon pretty soon after his first win. It was the finale for the Ultimate Fighter Tournament of Champions, and he was going up against Ryan Benoit. He snagged a split-decision victory over his opponent. But get this, out of all the cast members from that season who fought that night, only 2 others were in the mix. The tournament winner, Tim Elliott, lost in his championship bout with Demetrius Johnson and Matt Schnell. He was stopped in the first round by Rob Font in a bantamweight showdown. So who was the only one to come out on top at the finale? None other than our favorite fighter. He had started making a name for himself at this point. After all, he was the underdog 16th seed, and that made his wins a big deal. Just a little over 4 months later, he pulled off another win in the UFC. This time, submitting the seasoned fighter Dustin Ortiz in the second round. With that victory, his record climbed to 14-3, and he made his mark as one of the most promising rising stars in the 125-pound weight class. But that's not all. He was just getting started. The man wanted, no, promised to be a champion one day, and it was looking like that day would come soon until everything changed. People began to question, was Brandon just a one-hit wonder? Only 4 months after his victory streak, the Mexican fighter's journey came to a sudden halt, and that too as a headliner in his city. His opponent? None other than the guy it all began with, Sergio Pettis. This had to be destiny. The fight started with the fighter carefree, loose, and playful. Maybe he'd gotten cocky and just needed a reality check, because less than 2 minutes into the bout, he took Pettis' back and went for a submission. For the rest of the round, he kept peppering his opponent with short punches, making him question his life choices. He even split him above the eye on the left side. It was his first main event, and he was looking pretty damn good. But it didn't last long, and that was the only round he won. Pettis adjusted his game, stayed technical, and ended up winning the battle of the young and emerging flyweights. It was a tough break for Moreno, to be honest, but the story didn't end there. His next fight in Santiago, Chile, was with an old foe, Pantoja. And much to the dismay of the fans, he suffered the same fate, losing to the crafty Brazilian veteran by unanimous decision. Deja vu, anyone? 13 months after confidently predicting his future as a champion, the fighter found himself on a losing streak, and that wasn't the worst part. After his streak of losses, the UFC straight up cut ties with him. And here's the kicker, he was still ranked in the top 10 of the flyweight division at the time. Crazy, right? The whole thing was such a mess. There was so much confusion about whether he was still part of the company or not, and nobody seemed to have a clear answer. Talk about leaving the fans hanging. Everyone was left scratching their heads, wondering where the heck Moreno had disappeared to and what his status was as a UFC fighter. Turns out, the Assassin Baby wasn't even sure what was going on himself. He was taken out of the rankings in November or December of 2018, but he thought he was just shifting weight classes. Little did he know, he'd been cut out of the company. It wasn't until January 2019 that he finally grasped the whole situation, and that's when it hit him. He was out of the UFC completely, with no chance of getting another fight. He'd even tried getting a spot in the bantamweight division, but that division had been packed too. It took some time, but the Mexican fighter finally realized he had to move on. Getting cut didn't knock him down for good. He was determined to bounce back and make a name for himself once again. Funnily enough, he was back with the company a few months later. After a rough patch, the division started booming again, and sure enough, Moreno was brought back into the mix. In his first fight back, he went head-to-head with the undefeated newcomer Askar Askarov and ended up with a split draw result. Not a bad start, right? But here's the thing. Even though he was back in action, he hadn't tasted victory in his last 3 trips to the octagon, so he had some catching up to do. On top of that, he was way behind his opponents. While he was trying to get back on track, they were already on a roll, keeping their spots on the roster or making their way back to the big stage sooner than he did. But hey, the fighter wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He made a strong comeback in December 2019 and got a unanimous decision victory over his fellow TUF 24 castmate, Kai Kara France. Just a few months later, in March 2020, he came out on top of the Brazilian stalwart, Jussier Formiga. His second appearance came at UFC 255, where he again faced off against Brandon Royval and secured a first-round stoppage win. This fight was like a de facto title eliminator. And it happened on the same night that the champion, Davison Figueiredo, successfully defended his belt for the first time. That was enough to get the fans buzzing, and the two fighters didn't waste any time in satisfying them. On December 12, 2020, they were paired off in the main event of UFC 256. It was a showdown for the ages. The fight ended in a majority draw, a total nail-biter. Figueiredo's point deduction in the third round prevented him from taking the win and led the UFC to book an immediate rematch between the two fighters. The second of 4 fights to come, this one changed everything for Brandon. After traveling a long road with bumps and potholes, Assassin Baby finally started killing. He got into the octagon for a second bout with the Brazilian fighter, with only one thing on his mind. In the second round, his rival tried to take the fight to the ground, looking for a submission, but the fighter wasn't having any of it. He defended that guillotine choke like a pro. Sure, he took a nasty elbow from the bottom that gave him a mouse over his left eye, but that didn't stop him. He stayed right on top of the flyweight champ, wearing him down and draining his gas tank. Now, here's the epic moment. In the third round, Moreno landed an overhand right that made his rival hesitate for a split second, and that's just what the Mexican needed. He did everything to keep his opponent down, and it took a little struggle, but Figueiredo knew he was beat. He tapped out 2 minutes into the third round, giving the fighter the victory. After more than 1,000 days of hard work, he finally made good on his promise. On June 12, 2021, in his only fight of the year, he became the UFC flyweight champion, and he's been determined not to become a one-hit wonder since then. The fighter said it himself after he finally got hold of that belt. He had no intention of losing it again. He just didn't want to be that guy who changed his life with one fight, but then started to lose. Moreno wants to be one of the best, an actual legend. And that's going to take a lot more than one title win, which he ended up losing in the next bout with his favorite fighter. And yes, he did win it back again in their fourth and final matchup, but is this roller coaster worthy of a legend? Just some food for thought. So, from a roller coaster of wins and losses to being the 16th seed and a surprising debut. That's why Brandon Moreno is a one-hit wonder.